All right, good evening, everybody. This is our first experiment with a question and answer session, and my buddy Jeremy has been collating the questions and kind of framing them, and he's going to ask them, and I'll hopefully try to answer them, and he'll add some clarification, follow up if he thinks that's necessary, and we haven't done this yet, so who knows what's going to happen. However, I just really like some of the questions that have come in. So for me, I think it's already a success because it helps me get a little clarity on what's not coming off class clearly. Does that make sense? Maybe it does. I hope so.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, Jeremy, take it away. Question number one.
Hi, Wes. So the first question is from a listener from Michigan, and their question has to do with identity in regions in the United States rather than identity connected to the actual state of national identity. And one example that they give is in Michigan, people connect with an identity as opposed to the coastal elite kind of identity of America. So sometimes they feel frustrated that people in DC or New York don't really know that they exist, and they thought that even people in Canada might feel more closely connected with them than other people on the coast in the United States. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a great question, and we're going to deal with this a lot because I'm going to look at some individual states. Actually, someone mentioned Louisiana. I have a whole thing on Louisiana coming up. I think people will blow your mind. Blew my mind when I looked at it. So
Okay.
I think you'll like that. But I think it's better to understand the United States as a collection of regions, because if you look at the geography and the development patterns of different regions, they're so different, as I mentioned in the earlier episodes, than from each other. So like if you look at California going from almost nobody to 36 million, Michigan went from almost nobody to a couple of million. I forget now the numbers, but it's what, 20 years, some ridiculously short period of time. But then the growth rate really stopped. I mean, it really slowed down. And so then for the next 100 years, Michigan has grown at a relatively very moderate pace compared to a place like California or Texas, which just exploded. And so I think regional differences are very important. There's a book called Albion's Seed, in which the author tracks different regions of the early United States in particular, but the influence continuing today based on where some of the early settlers came from. And he does it on like 28 parameters about what they eat, when they eat. It was a whole socioeconomic analysis. But I do think that, yeah, if you're in Michigan and you look at Canada and you go, we might be more like them. Look at the geography, look at the weather. There's also the notion, I think this is more recently post-war, World War II, they have the concept of the flyover state. Of course, you have to be able to fly over things before you can have this concept. But the first time I encountered this, I thought, wow, if people know this is what people on the West Coast of New York call the rest of the country, because you just fly over it to get from New York to California to LA, basically. And it's it's pejorative, because it's like, fuck people in Michigan, basically. They don't count. They're not really Americans.
Right. Yeah, this question reminded me of a debate that happens in rock and roll. Like, what is the best? Why are there not very many American bands in the question about who's the greatest rock band of all time? And this is when you look at the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, and then U2, The Cure, the Smiths, on and on. It's for some reason heavily British, and the debate, the people explaining that on Twitter often say that America is too regional, and that's one explanation for why Creedence Clearwater or the Doors or something don't, it doesn't quite fit as like the greatest rock band of all time. It's like they're good, but and so that reminded me of maybe America's just too regional to have one, solid greatest. I don't know if that makes any sense.
And I think, yes, it does, absolutely. And I think one of the part of what happened is, and someone mentioned this is one of the comments. It used to be that we had this myth of a unified culture. This is one of the things I want to talk about. So when you have, just as the example, there used to be 3 TV stations and they all played the same stuff. And so, if you watch TV, which a lot of people did, you had this impression that there was this shared homogenous culture. This never existed. It never existed on the ground. And so we have this very, I think it causes a lot of cultural dissonance in the United States when that transition. And if you talk to older people today who are frustrated about the state of the country, one thing they'll articulate is like, oh, we used to be so unified. We used to be together. We used to be, we used to know what it meant to be American, which is one of the things that got me thinking about this series. When, if you look at it, this is never true, but there was this sort of popular cultural overlay of like, oh yeah, if your TV was on when the I Love Lucy show was on, 70% of people watched that show. And so you're like, oh, we all were going to talk about that one show. But it just elides the total diversity that Michigan is not California, is not Texas, is not Florida, is not New Hampshire. These are.
And that brings us to the second question, which was from L from California, who was asking about, was America ever homogenous? And they're referring to, we all, before in the 50s and 60s, we all read the same newspapers or watched the same TV shows. And now it feels like we've lost that kind of homogeneity. And then S responded and talked about, kind of pushed back and said that right now we're more homogenous than ever. And I think because of the internet and because of more information being transferred, but we, for the first time, can see the subtle differences between cultural, regional ideas because we can see it on the internet. So what were your thoughts on that? Was there ever a homogenous culture? It sounds like you've kind of come down on no.
No. In fact, one of the things you can look at is what food was in grocery stores. I mean, this is just, if you want to go look at really concrete things. And so what people ate, again, if you go right up to the 1950s, it's the post-war, the first clover leaf. Now, I wish I knew this. I'll have to look up the date. The first interstate bypass was built in the United States in like 1965 or something. It's some crazily recent date. And you realize like, oh, you could not really even drive. You could, in theory, drive across the country.
Right.
But until you get like the novel On the Road, that is the first time that you could reasonably make these trips. So the road was not just this expression of freedom. It was also an expression of, oh, look, we can actually drive around and see each other. This was not possible before. And so this notion of a unified culture is simply totally inaccurate. So if you go back to Michigan again, like which Bob Dylan, he was from Minnesota, right? But a lot of the American rock and roll people, I think I've mentioned this before, talk about turning on their radios one night at AM or FM is just coming in, but generally AM. And they could start picking up these really powerful broadcasts from the South for the first time. And they said it just blew their minds when they got like a blues, Wolfman Jack or these huge, powerful stations out of Memphis that were broadcasting, and the weather would be right. And at midnight, they could get music that they'd never heard before. And so the notion that you could live in the United States and not even know that blues existed, right? Like this is like this entire massive cultural movement that's going on in one place. And then when this other place hears it, they're just like, well, I don't know what's going on. I want to go there because this is a whole different world.
Right.
So it's a very consistent expression.
That question from the person from California, it sounded like it was informed by the kind of current events with the idea of, Americans being polarized in current political culture. Does, Florida versus California having very different kinds of politically, does this relate to our current moment with a lot of conversation about kind of civil distrust,
Yeah,
polarization.
and I think this is one thing that I'm really going to be driving towards through the whole arc of this. So I really want to land on that question, but spoiler alert or whatever. But part of this was what happened when the wall came down is the myth of conformity was lost. The little bit that we really did agree about, we're not communists, right? We're not them, vanishes. And then we go, oh, well, now we're back onto what all the other things we share in common. And then what we found out was like, oh man, we don't really share. We're like, wow. It's not that there are things that we do share. So I don't want to say it's nothing, but what we found is we were not nearly as homogenous culturally and in our assumptions and all this as we had been behaving. And once that external force was removed, internal, what the underlying forces simply express themselves.
Okay.
And just as a number, just again, you could look at this, and I don't have it off the top of my head, so these will be a little wrong. At some later lecture, I'm sure I'll include the specific details. But when Trump ran against Clinton the first time, if only Confederate states could vote, Trump would have won either all the electoral votes or all but 5 or something. I forget, but essentially all the electoral votes. And if only states that were Union had voted, Clinton would have won the same, almost a total same landslide.
Okay.
And so this notion that unity, the Civil War is over, blah, blah. If the voting pattern is almost so black and white. I think Georgia flipped for Biden, but basically those patterns that were laid down in regional divisions like the Civil War are still obviously hugely prevalent. And you can find this map, it's online, people can look it up, and you go, wow, the war ended, whatever, 160 years ago, but those political lines are still there. So the unity, I would say, was always exaggerated, the homogeneity at least.
Okay. Yeah, and sticking to the kind of regional concept here, Michael De Silva asks a question about East Coast and West Coast, and also large cities versus kind of rural areas. He asks, after World War II, there were more infrastructure developments in cities. Did that create a kind of certain kind of homogenous culture in cities where the money went? Also the railroad, talking about did the railroad have a similar kind of effect for bringing places together culturally that were along the railroad?
Yes. And so this is where you start to get the forces that do unify the country. And everybody talked about this at the time. So when the railroad was going in, when the telegraph was going in, consistently commentators, social scientists, writers talked about the notion of, oh, for the first time, we're going to be able to bring the country together. It doesn't take months to get across the country. It takes a couple of days. This is going to be spectacular, but it takes a long time for that unification to start happening. And on top, this is one of the problems why it's so, why this idea of US culture and development is so complicated, is because urbanization kicks off over the top of these, like this cultural vacuum that I have been talking about. And so in most countries, again, China, all over Europe, what you'll see is you have a major hub, like say a Paris or a Beijing, and then urbanization kicks off. And so they start to grow. And then pretty soon they come to dominate. Agrarian life becomes less common. City life becomes more common. In the United States, there were no cities. I mean, there was the original cities associated with the early colonies, but Michigan didn't have a city. Minnesota had no cities. Washington, Oregon, California, right? None of these, they had 0 cities. And so their pattern of urbanization is just crazy. More people live in the original, 100 years ago, the original arrondissement of Paris had more population than they have today.
Uh-huh.
Greater Paris is larger, but 100 years ago, there were 2 million people living in the heart of what is, the heart of Paris, the original, not the original, but the traditional core of Paris. Today, there's like 6 million people in the greater area.
Uh-huh.
In LA 100 years ago, there were like 50,000 people. And today there's like, whatever, I don't know. It depends where you draw the lines around Orange County or whatever, but it's, 6 to 10 million.
Yeah.
And so to have a core of 2 million and then urbanize is a totally different experience than going from 0 to millions. And
so these urban centers in America aren't as homogenous as you might imagine because of the infrastructure money that went there.
Well, they're more homogenous in time because they just don't have these old cores, but they're less formed by any pre-existing cultural norms. And so it's like this is why it's interesting. You can see very powerful differences between neighborhoods built in the 50s and all that. Oh, then we did something different in the 70s. Oh, then we did something different in the 80s. And it's like, and there's so much of it because these decades saw millions of people move in, another million, and then another million. And so there's no like coherence. There's no center that holds it all together. There's no traditional building patterns that would maintain it. There's no set of standards. They're always changing construction rules and laws, right? And so materials change rapidly. So the rapid urbanization that has happened all over the world, not just the United States, has a very different pattern in the United States and has a very different pattern from the East Coast, which is back to the question.
Michael's question, yeah.
Where in New York, you did have a pre-existing city, right? It had been there for a while. New Amsterdam, it had been there for a while, and it grew from there, and it had very different geographical boundaries, as opposed to basically anything.
Yeah, and what about the similarities or differences between the modern East Coast in America and West Coast? This idea of the coastal elites have like a similar feeling from the perspective of Michigan, but Michael's asking about how are they different, and his example was about how Silicon Valley, and this is an idea he has, is that originally the engineers on the East Coast wanted to go west for cheaper real estate, and then so many of them went to San Francisco that there became this kind of Silicon Valley. Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, and so I think one thing that he's articulating here is, and this is also happening all over the world, is on top of all these other things that are happening with American cultural development, rapid urbanization, is you have the globalization of urban elites. So one of the problems that Michigan has, or basically everywhere that's not one of these cities, is people in LA or San Francisco or New York or Miami or Atlanta in the United States. A bunch of them, not all of them, but a bunch of them are in global, basically compensation, pay, education, outlook. Like this is what they're thinking about. This is how they view the world. If you're not them, like your wage, this is why people go, oh, who can afford $1 million homes, right? How can there be so many $1 million homes? Well, if you have enough people who are on global pay scales, they can. And so the pay of someone in rural Michigan just has it's like they're in a different country, literally in a different world. And you saw this, but this is not an accident. This was a choice. If you look back at sort of like the debate during the first Clinton administration, when he wanted to pass NAFTA, the people in Michigan, people in the Midwest, the like union Democrats said, look, this is horrible for us. And basically the Clinton administration and the Republicans who actually needed the Republican votes to pass NAFTA said, look, yeah, but it's great for the urban elites because, it's insurance, banking, all these sort of investment products, so we don't care about Midwest factory workers, screw them. We care about these urban elites. And it really created a dynamic shift. But that happened not just in the United States. That's been a global phenomenon where if you're in Beijing or Shanghai or you're, and this is like a different world from rural China.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah.
Mentally, folks in on the coast might be thinking globally, this kind of cosmopolitan culture that's really maybe nothing to do with American culture, or not that much. It's just in any city globally, there's certain people who are thinking like that and have the kind of resources and education, and then folks just who are living outside of there have a whole different world. Is that
That's a whole different, and a lot of the people that live there as well, right? So like LA is one of the largest Hispanic cities in the world. Nobody thinks of it this way. It's like a huge Spanish speaking global capital of Spanish culture. But in the United States, we just, like, that doesn't exist, right? We don't think of it that way. So even our global elites don't think of that sort of cultural diversity. So it's a weird,
even in the cities, yeah.
Even in the cities, like, we ignore the fact that, oh, look, there's this huge, massive culture here that was here before, by the way. Like, California became a state, had Spanish citizens there, or, I guess, I don't know, settlers from Spain had moved up. Again, Native Americans don't count. We'll talk about in the next lecture. But yeah, so this will take several lectures of unraveling, but it is this important layer upon layer of urbanization, the decline of rural, which we really never had in the way that most countries had. One last statistic on this, I think, is telling. I read this just a few weeks ago in France, just before World War I, 60% of the population lived in cities or towns of 2,000 people or less.
Okay.
So there's very little empty space in France. Like, everywhere you go, there's just little pockets of just small village, small village, small village, small village. Up in the north, there's a little more open space. Gascony's a little more, but compared to the United States, like Kansas does not exist. Idaho, wide open plain. This doesn't happen here. And you go, oh, and so even the notion of urbanization doesn't mean the same thing, because there was never this massive agrarian population.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move off of the regional questions, and this one has to do with the Cormac McCarthy lecture, which was a kind of a pre-lecture for this series. Kay asks, based on a quote from McCarthy, that there is no such thing as life without bloodshed, and I'm going to read the full quote as is quoted here. I think the notion that this species can be improved in some way, that everyone could live in harmony, is a really dangerous idea. Those who are afflicted with this notion are the first ones to give up their souls, their freedom. Your desire that it be that way will enslave you and make your life vacuous. What are your thoughts on this quote and how it relates to McCarthy's mythopoetic writing of the human condition?
Yeah, I think this is why I wanted to start with McCarthy quotes like this, which I find it's so it encapsulates so much of American thinking that it's hard to even unravel it. But just as briefly as possible, we will return to these questions because they're very important. I have a whole lecture coming up, which I call the tragic comedy of the tragedy of the commons. That's my title. Yeah, it's a bit complicated, but it is this notion of the tragedy of the commons, which is an American idea, is a tragic comedy. And I think this is what he's articulating it. The notion that cooperation and communal processes are a threat it's not uniquely American, but by God, we really ran with it. And this is part of understanding American culture and understanding this core vacuum at the core of American culture is the notion that somehow, in some way, communalism and cooperative existence is dangerous, limiting, horrifying, and that all we live by blood is what we do. It's just historically inaccurate, right? We were, particularly today, it takes so much cooperation on so many levels to get anything done. that is just, it's ridiculous to speak of that, but a lot of it's become made invisible by technology. A lot of it is invisible, so we feel sort of both more and less free. But I think McCarthy has articulated this core element of American culture that makes no sense, because again, we've always been cooperative. You have to be cooperative, and yet we fear and are terrified of that, and we feel that any imposition is going to limit us. And if anybody wants to do a little pre-reading for the episode that'll come up probably 2 or 3 from now on this specific subject, is you can read Emerson's Self-Reliance or Thoreau's Walden, both hugely influential and sort of softer versions of what McCarthy just really runs with. And you'll get a sense there if you read them from this going, oh, okay, self-reliance, that's a good thing, right? Walden is one of those great, like, oh, this back to nature sort of things, but in a weird and terrifyingly American fashion that sort of we'll delve into why this might be troublesome.
And it sounds like the next lecture on libertarianism, is that correct?
I think that'll be like 2, maybe 3. The next one's going to be on Native Americans and African American culture.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And then a follow-up to this, Kay asks about this relating to totalitarian ideologies such as fascism. I think he's talking about, or she's talking about, the idea that if you have this feeling that, you know, we can improve the human condition, that then leaders can kind of co-opt that idea and say, well, I'm going to be the one to improve it for you. And I think McCarthy might be saying it's a myth. You know, don't allow yourself to even think that it could become better, or else you're just giving yourself over to, you know, fascism or that possibility. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so many, but well, how much time? But quickly as I can.
You got 30 seconds.
Yeah, he starts from the notion of the human condition is bad, right? So but you don't want to try to improve it, right? Because bad is the best you can get. It's sort of this inverse of not Camus, who wrote, Leibniz had we live in the best of all possible worlds, right? And this idea of we're in a great place. Okay, no, we can't have that. But you can't improve the human condition. Can you not improve it because we're maximally good? Like, hey, we're all good. Life is great. It's wonderful. It's filled with joy and beauty. And so don't mess with it. This is so wonderful. See, McCarthy's not saying that. He's saying, like, no, this is the worst of all possible worlds, filled with death and murders and suffering, but don't try to improve it, because that will only make it even more awful. And it's like, wow. But noticing that this dichotomy that's being set up between independent sort of isolation, nightmare, desert, and totalitarian oppression and worse. So there's no like cooperative meadow where we all share a sandwich and go for a swim in the pond, right? That's kind of it doesn't figure heavily in his thinking or his writing. And this is the thing with Thoreau and Emerson, the seeds are definitely there when they talk about self-reliance, when they talk about, I lived by myself. I mean, this is the myth of Thoreau, because it's not true. He did not live by himself. But the myth of Thoreau is, he went out there, he built his own cabin, he founded his own thing, and he lived on his own. And this is like this ideal state of being that saves you from the bad thing of cooperative endeavor. And so, yeah. So, but I would say
kind of a false dichotomy. Like you have to choose one or the other. And that's not how it works.
Yeah, there is space between a monk in a cave and fascist, totalitarian, or communist oppression, right? Like there's room in between those two. I would posit that.
Okay. Yeah, and the final question is just a little note on the map. So I guess the map had a few inaccuracies in it. You want to kind of clear that huge question up here?
Yeah. So this is I should spend more time looking more carefully. Like, I just want a map of the colonies. I thought, oh, map of the colonies. So I just threw it up there. And it turns out that they had put New York on twice, and so they left Vermont out. They left Vermont out, and then
Okay.
And they had a 14th state that wasn't included for a while. So it's like, so it was a not entirely accurate map of the colonies. But if you do look at the map, besides the errors, what I was trying to get a sense of is how little of the United States, as we conceptualize it, actually was the United States at the dawn of the revolution, right? Like there's a lot to come. And so it's a very odd, it's hard for us mentally, or at least for me, and I think for most people, to reconstruct the history that we go, oh, the United States, it's like it was there just waiting to be colored in, right? Like, I don't know, like, oh, the condos were built, we just need to get our surfboards and make it to California and settle the West Coast, and then everything was groovy. When in fact, it was this long ongoing process of the westward expansion, manifest destiny, or whatever you want to call it. But what this meant was, again, is 80-90% of the territory was not patterned, and it would take more than a century, which is to say way more than half of US history, before a significant number of people lived anywhere in the totality of the United States. Like, just there weren't many people there. Right. Which is, it's weird to think about, because you go, oh, well, that's right. Like, if you look at the map and then go, hey, look, nobody was there, who were Americans, of course. Even when they began to exist, they weren't there. And so, when American history and where it starts is really a troubling question. And it causes us to misunderstand, like I said, the cultural underpinnings of our country. Because in fact, if you look at that map and look where Michigan is, we'll just use Michigan as forget the West Coast, which takes forever. It's a long walk. And remember, most people are walking, right? If you're in New York and you go, I want to go to Michigan, it's going to take a long time to get there. It's not just around the corner. And that'll be the last note I'll say on spatial issues. And because you brought up the train, while that looks really big on the map, that expansion, also remember, until the railroad, but even when the railroad was there, because there were so few rail lines, the US was much bigger than it is today because of the speed of transport. Right? Like, it was, when it took months to cross the continent, if you thought in time as opposed to space, the psychological scale of the US was just enormous. I mean, there really was, when people's relatives left and said, hey, yeah, we're moving out to Texas, it was like, bye, right? It's not like, yeah, we're going to see you again. No, you're just vanishing into the nether reaches. And maybe a letter might come at some point. So apologies for the errors of the map, entirely my fault. I should have looked more carefully. I just grabbed one. I'm like, oh, there's the colonies, throw it up there. And then somebody made a very good eye, by the way, good catch on that. So.
Yeah. Well, Wes, thank you for, these are all the questions I've selected, and thank you for answering them. I think it's going to be really helpful to kind of flesh out the lectures people are listening to.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate it for doing the work. And hopefully this was helpful to the listeners and ask questions. And like I said, we'll try and flesh it out, because it is, I mean, these are complex and subtle issues. And like I said, this is why I said there's going to be an infinite number of episodes because there's so much dynamism and so many misapprehensions, not because history is written wrong, just because there's so many weird things that are hard to grasp about the peculiarities of American history that I thought, it would be worth spending this extra time. So thank you very much. And we'll have a new episode up, hopefully within about a week of whenever this airs.
Very good. Thank you, Wes.
All right. Thanks, man.